Uh, so I'm quite privileged really to introduce and moderate this session, introduce my friend and advisor, Dr. Brendon Hemily, who's our guest speaker today, and he's going to talk about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, but I can't really think of anyone better to talk about this topic than Brendon Hemily. He's been really straddling both worlds of academia and industry, so he knows both worlds, and he's been always trying to bridge the gap between the two worlds and helped us a lot. So, just a quick introduction about Brandon. So, Brandon is an independent consultant with 40 years of experience of working with the transit industry in both Canada and the USA, specializing in transit planning, management, and technology issues. He provided support to US DOT from 2007 to 2018 related to transit ITS, and he also worked earlier in his career for 15 years at CUTA, the Canadian Urban Transit Association, where he was responsible for all research and technical activities. He's been also senior advisor to TAL since its inception, and he's active in numerous associations, in particular the Transportation Research Board, TRB, where he's past chair and emeritus member of the Public Transportation Planning Committee and recent past chair of TRB's Public Transportation Group. So uh, I'm really very much looking forward to this presentation, and I hope everyone will benefit from it. So, Brandon, floor is yours.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, yep.
Okay, Kareem, could you put up the slides? Thank you.
Yeah, can you see it?
I can't. Can Emmer, do you?
Yeah. We do see it. Yeah,
Uh, but I don't.
yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, let me share my screen.
Let's try one more
Not sure
time.
why I don't see it. There we go. I see it now. Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Emmer. Yeah, so I'm happy to be doing this presentation because it is a topic near and dear to my heart. And I'm going to try to stimulate some interest, some thoughts, plant some seeds, talk about both benefits and challenges of using data that's coming off of technology. Next slide. Thank you. So, agenda. I'm going to sort of first just say where I'm coming from and why this is a topic of interest to me. Then talk about the evolution of the use of ITS data and sort of transit analytics data, and it's been a long time coming. Then talk about challenges faced first by the transit agencies and then by academics, and then my some moderated optimism that we're coming to a position of convergence, and lots of interesting topics are being pursued by being analyzed, the use of data, as we already saw this morning, and then a few suggestions of what can be done. Next slide. So, next slide. So, I've had a very good fortune of having a very interesting career. Originally aimed to be an academic, but then ended up being hired first by George Smirk in the United States, running transit training programs, and then in Canada by Al Cormier at the Canadian Urban Transit Association, where I worked 15 years. And in both cases, and in fact, in my whole career, I've always been in a position where I deal with both academics and people involved in innovation and with practitioners and transit agencies of all sizes and different locations. And these programs sort of led me into the whole identifying the benefits of dissemination, the need for applied research, and the promise that comes from data that was coming out of the sort of the ITS technologies. I've now been a consultant for 24 years, working both Canada and the US. But I don't do normal consulting. I do applied research, still sort of in that position of trying to bridge the gap between research innovation worlds and practitioner worlds. And as part of that, I've been involved in several associations, CUDA, APTA in the States, ITS Canada, where I was chair of a transit ITS committee, but especially TRB, where I've been involved for 45 years. And if you don't know about TRB, I hope you will become, it's free to become a friend of committees. And it's one of the unique organizations that brings together researchers, practitioners of all modes, government folks, consultants, and has its annual meeting every year in January. Has 180 committees, all modes, and there are 12 transit committees, and I was chair of the Transit Planning Committee and then chair of the whole public transportation group for 4 years. Next slide. So as part of that, that's been something that always been involved in applied research. And like I said, the data, the use of data to get data-driven decision-making has always been something that I think we should be striving for as much as I'm passionate about the public transportation field. However, this is tempered by the fact that everything in the industry is slow. It takes a long time for everything to happen, for any changes to happen, significant changes. And this is certainly the case for the use of data and analytics. Next slide. So to illustrate that, here's I'm a big buff of history, but the ITS systems, CAD AVL systems, date all the way back to the 1980s. In fact, when I was working for CUDA, I organized the International Conference on AVL in 1988. And one of the sessions was a session on using AVL data. And then following that, as part of the Strategic Transit Research Program that CUDA was conducting, we did a study. I managed a study on the use of AVL data, APC data for planning, all the way back in 1991. In 2005, there was a very influential report by TCRP, which is a program of research in the Transportation Research Board, which looked at the use of AVL APC data for planning and operations. But it wasn't until much later that suppliers actually started providing analytic modules where you could access the data and use it. And then there was a process with mostly academics that started in 2014, where every year or every other year, there's a workshop on transit data to look at the evolution. First, the focus was on smart cards, and then on AVL and APC. And in fact, as Amr mentioned, Amr and I and the TAL team organized in 2020, in the heart of the beginning of the COVID pandemic, transit data, but we made a major effort to try to get practitioners involved, and we're very proud of it. And all the information, the recordings, and all the sessions are still there, and it's a wonderful resource. And more recently, there's been a couple TCRP studies looking at how you can use data, and one of them focuses on TIDES, which is a transit ITS specification, exchange specification that was spearheaded by John Levin of Metro Transit in Minneapolis, which is hopefully will make it much more easy to use these the exchange information about data and exchange actual reports about the applications from the data. Next slide, please. So this, just to give you and illustrate how long ago, this is from the 1991 report, which collated the uses of data. It was very simple in terms of tabular representations and graphs, but some transit systems were already using CAD AVL data for looking at, and APC data for looking at running time profiles, maximum load points, ons and offs, schedule adherence. So, that's a long time ago. Next slide. Why has it taken so long? I go to a lot of conferences and have been monitoring the situation, and it's been a source of great frustration over the years, although I'm modestly optimistic in recent times. But why is it taking so long? So first, challenges for the transit agencies. So I'm going to present a view. This is a personal view of my worldview of the transit industry to try to explain what is happening and why it is so hard um, for the industry to really step up and move and use the data. Next slide. So I see the transit world in 4 tiers. And this is just based on experience, and the numbers are just personal numbers based on my observation of many, many meetings and looking at and monitoring lots of different sources of actual practice and of research and so forth. But at the top, I see what I call the cutting edge. These are agencies that, for whatever the reason is, because they're private sector trying to maximize profits, or because there's a culture of research, uh, they always strive to be innovators or optimizers. And in any given field, and I'm afraid that people may have seen this, my presentation of my worldview before, but I've actually become more pessimistic and downgraded the numbers. So in any given field, I don't think there's any more than 3% of the number of agencies that are really at the cutting edge. I mean, these are agencies like Transport for London and RATP in Paris and MTR in Hong Kong and LTA in Singapore that believe in research, believe in being on the cutting edge, and are able to get the resources to do so. Next slide. At the bottom level, the bottom tier, are agencies, the vast majority of small agencies, rural agencies, small city agencies, even some big agencies where politicians keep the transit agency because of its social benefits and its purpose of equity and serving those who are poor, who don't have access to other modes. So they're tolerated and at a low level of subsistence level. And my estimate is that's 35% of agencies fall into that category. And they're never, well, I don't want to say never. There are some small ones that are innovative, but by and large, they're never given the resources to really be very even really to get up to best practices, even if they desire to do so. Next slide. The second tier from the top is what I call best practices. These are incrementalists. They're constantly looking for what is going on, and they actually pursue it and implement perceived best practices. And my estimate is that there's 10 to 12% of the agencies that are in that category. What does that leave? Next slide. 50%, of agencies are in what I would call satisficers. They're standard practice. The policy boards and the managers they hire, all they want is safe, stable operations that keep them out of the press, that keep them out of the media. And when there's a problem, we're not trying to optimize what the best solution is. We're trying to get back to the stability and consistent standard operating procedures that are part of the industry. So that creates a very strong situation where it's difficult to innovate, and innovation and research is risk taking, and the industry is very risk averse. Next slide. So I'm sure all those who are in the industry will agree with me that transit is primarily an operations-driven, risk-averse industry relying on standard operating procedures, and is in the public eye all the time, fishbowl environment, as they say, where anything that goes wrong is in the media and is cause for concern. In addition, because it's in the public sector and because of rules of transparency and accountability and trying to avoid corruption, procurement is complicated and data protection rules are extensive. Resources are constrained. There's a need although it's difficult, to prove the value of research. And vendors and consultants respond to the industry RFPs. So if the industry is not asking for the use of data and tools to use that data, vendors and consultants are not going to be providing that. So research, innovation, and use of data are hard sells. But I think data analytics is a really promising application of research, which is part of the reason I've been working with Amr on the efforts and initiatives of the Transit Analytic Lab. Next slide. So the use of transit IDS data and analytics has been a long time coming. Other complications, the uses that some of the key ITS systems like AVL and AFC were not designed with data in mind. That was totally an afterthought. AVL systems were designed for security purposes, dealing with assaults, dealing with sick passengers, dealing with accidents, incident management. AFC systems were making sure the money is collected and accounted for. And then there are many, many practical challenges for all the transit agencies that have suffered through this process of cleaning up their data in order to be able to use it. There are many, many challenges, and I documented many of these in a short 20-page paper in 2015. And sadly, I think many agencies are still struggling with those challenges. If anybody's interested in that discussion paper, just send me an email and I'll be glad to send it to you. It's on the internet. Next slide. That was on the transit practitioner side. What about the researchers? Next slide. Well, there's a real challenge for researchers trying to pursue applied research. Applied research is generally not valued in the engineering academic system, a bit more in planning, but what academics have to do early in their career is publish in academic journals. These are journals that nobody else but academics have access to. And to do that kind of cutting edge methodological research, they need data. And so there's now at least more publicly available data. There's open data, the new tools like passive data. But some of the data is private and requires partners. So collaboration, as much as I strongly believe in it, what I tell my academic friends, there has to be a quid pro quo. There is no such thing as free data. You have to be providing some benefit that's worth it to the transit agency, and that they are getting something out of it that helps them in their pursuits. So you need partners, which requires communications, it requires trust, it requires access to data. You have to think about what the authority or operator needs are, and then ability to test, evaluate, and deploy the applications that might emerge. Next slide. So from my point of view, dissemination remains a fundamental challenge for applications. Like I said, journal articles, which is where academics have to publish early in their career to get tenure, to get advancements. Only other academics ever read these journals, only have access to them. They're very expensive in most cases. Private partners, like all the discussion some years ago when TNCs first started appearing, Uber and Lyft, they had no interest in sharing data. So it was very hard to try to develop partnerships with these private entities. Conferences, what happens? At best, you get even if you see something fascinating, if you're lucky, you might be able to get the PDF of the slides. So this is where, again, the TIDE specification hopefully will set up platforms, which is now being managed through mobilitydata.org. We'll set up a platform that will allow for the exchange of data, but as more, from my point of view, more interestingly, the exchange of applications, so that if an application is developed in one agency using the TIDES platform, it would be relatively easy to transfer it to another agency. And I like I said, I've been involved in TRB for a long time, but to be honest, there's a very small number or relatively small number of transit agencies who are pursuing best practices that attend on a regular basis. Some universities have been trying to do applied research, uh, such as Ammer here with TAL and Polytechnique. Others and they organize occasionally workshop for practitioners like this workshop, and disseminate. But the most important thing that comes out of the academic world, is the fact that dissemination occurs by the placement of bright students in transit organizations and consulting firms. This is very promising, but it's a long-term process. Next slide. So after that sort of gloomy overview, I want to say I think there's some optimism in the fact that there's a growing convergence. There's more data and analytics-based research that is interested in applications that are practical. And I think there's a general interest also within transit agencies more and more to really move towards data-driven decision making. Next slide. So how does one see that? Well, first, the data needs to be transformed into information. So that allows you to really do analysis of what does it take to be more effective, more efficient. And there are different steps. There can be, we make the distinction between descriptive data and information, prescriptive and predictive, and then prescriptive. So there are different ways that data can be used. But within transit agencies, it's a growing recognition of it being a strategic resource in terms of business intelligence, data analytics, understanding the use of KPIs, key performance indicators, growing interest in dashboards. We've had some already presented today, decision support systems, and the whole world of open data as well. Next slide. So in the academic world, despite the challenges, I perceive that there's a growing number of academics that really want to have an impact and that want to use data and analytics to inform reality, and that means doing more applied research. So this has been facilitated by several things. ITS and AFC systems technologies are more mature. They're increasingly designed to enable easier access to the data that they produce. There are new visualization and analytic tools. We've seen some of those this morning. There's increased discussion of use cases. A lot of academics, they've sort of learned how they can do this by doing a dual track approach to combine academic research with applied research. Sometimes that has to do with the academic research being pursued by PhD students and the more practical research, applied research being pursued by master's students. There's other developments that have been really interesting. I helped create a new committee that started, now 4 or 5 years ago, at TRB on transit data, and they've been incredibly active in terms of organizing webinars and sharing information. And then a growing number of university centers have started focusing on transit data and analytics, and not just modeling demand and networks, which is sort of the core of many academic programs. But some of the universities that have pursued a more applied research direction, MIT probably was the forefront of this with Nigel Wilson. But now there's a relationship between MIT and Northeastern, University of Toronto, TAL, Polytechnique, TU Delft, the Catholic University in Chile, the University of Chile, University of Kyoto, Queensland University, Ohio State University. A growing number of universities are really trying to look at practical applications that can make use of the data coming out of technology. Next slide. So getting into what you can do with the data. So I developed a typology that was in the report, the discussion paper I mentioned earlier. And there's all sorts of things you can do with it. You can do systematic monitoring. This data can be used to set up data dashboards for external consumption, or dashboards for internal use, looking at executive management and KPIs and alarms that set up that trigger, when the threshold of bunching or whatever occurs, that then there's action that can be followed up. So monitoring. And then there's just service operations planning, and the baseline starting point is, of course, on-time performance and schedule adherence, running time analyses. One of the interesting little things to think about is academics have always had a very keen interest in origin destination tables, but the transit industry itself has not, and with some exceptions. And those exceptions in the world of data are really places that are on the cutting edge, because there's so few of them around in North America. You can do analysis of operator performance, looking at different behavior operators, which has a big impact on on-time performance. You can do strategic analyses. Campaigns and major redesigns now rely on data from GTFS or GTFS-RT, much more than in the past, where it was much more static data. It was a source of 5-year transit plans. You can do tactical analyses. I've seen delays by intersection, locations for priority treatment, excessive stop dwell time, stop consolidation, fare evasion, exploratory data mining, looking at safety analyses of where accidents occur and trying to dig down what are the causes of those accidents. Accessibility and equity and access to health opportunities is a growing area of interest for the industry. And then we're getting now to a point where we're finally getting into decisions support for real-time operational control, for service restoration, bunching and gaps, as some of the presentation by Gio this morning, and detour management and bus bridging. Next slide. So having participated in several of the transit data workshops myself, I tried to synthesize a little bit some of the themes that were emerging, that have been emerging over the last couple of years. So, of course, a lot of academics are interested in methodological developments. So, methodologies to clean data, new technologies to collect data, methodologies for origin destination inference engines, like accuracy of new methodologies versus traditional methods, transit assignment, capacity versus vehicle scheduling, scheduling and optimization, rail simulation. Next slide. And then, and analyses of looking at different kinds of analyses, looking at travel behavior at the bus stop level, route choice, what happens in cases of disruptions, and looking at demand and characteristics in general, mobility knowledge, sources of delay, focus for priority, on-time performance, overloads and pass-ups, service planning, e.g. transfers, optimization. Next slide. And then we have some new horizons, and Tao is involved in several of these, but the use of passive data, we're going to have a presentation later about the use of Wi-Fi data, behavior and disruptions, looking at what happens when there are disruptions, the crowding, passenger movement, transferring to other modes like TNCs, predictive analytics, trying to identify where passenger overloads will occur. Real-time operational control, as we saw this morning, gaps and bunching. Linking performance to experience is something I think is really interesting new development. Social media data, looking at emotional and behavioral patterns and responses, in some cases using Twitter data and things of that sort to look at emotional responses. Machine learning and AI is exploding. COVID response visualization real time. So there's been a lot of analysis trying to figure out what happened, where are we going. A lot of analysis on accessibility and equity taking place these days. And then dashboards, as I mentioned, for operations planning, public, both internal and public facing. Next slide. I think there are some areas that we could pursue, spend more effort on. The European Union developed two standards on quality of service for public transportation. If anybody's interested, send me an email. I'd be glad to send them to you. But what they developed, which I thought was very interesting, was distinguishing the sort of what we, as technicians, technical people, measure in terms of measurement performance. But that's only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is how is it actually perceived by the customers? And there are an increasing number of tools trying to link what happens in terms of performance, in terms of reliability and so forth, with whether you're able to keep retention of customers, or when do they leave and for what reasons. Also, other areas which I don't think we've spent enough effort on: price elasticities, fares versus service elasticities, fares versus ridership. The vast majority of transit agencies are still using the simple Curtis Simpson rule minus 0.3 for fare elasticities. And now analytics to support operations and management. And then, what's this new mobility ecosystem, and there were some interesting presentations this morning about ODT and how you integrate ODT with fixed route. And it's a growing area of interest and of deployment. And then data fusion longer term. Transit industry tends to only focus on itself, but there's a whole world out there in the general ITS world called connected automated vehicles, and that's going to change the way traffic control is happening. And there'll be some interesting presentations tomorrow as part of the CATS Day to look at some of the research related to that. And there's smart cities as well that are even larger set of circles of data that we should be considering. Yes, next slide. So some suggestions of what can be done to apply applied research. My joke to academics, and as part of the transit data sessions, is what's the point of doing applied research if it's never applied? And so it's not easy, but here are a couple suggestions. Next slide. So back to my 4-tier chart of the world. The focus, most academics tend to focus on the cutting edge operators, but not all. And that is useful and it's interesting, but its impact on the industry as a whole is relatively minor, because what it does is inform what best practices might be. The bigger problem is, how do we move the 50% of satisfied service standard practitioners to move up to best practice? And that requires much more dissemination, and it requires adoption. And so it's, making sure that policymakers and the general managers they hire understand the benefits from this analysis, from analytics, and provide the tools and especially the expertise to make that happen. Next slide. So what does that mean there's lots of transit managers, mid-level managers that are, fighting against odds to sort of say, we need better tools, we need expertise. And so one has to make the case for data analytics to policymakers and management to make sure they understand And they can see that. And so looking at use cases, looking at our returns on investment, especially looking at how you can use visualization dashboards. Sometimes those are very powerful in terms of, convincing people the benefit of these tools and so forth. And then facilitating technology transfer. I've mentioned TIDES several times, but also involved in the associations, CUDA, APTA, Cal ITP in California. Caltrans has been doing some incredibly interesting developments for the benefit of Californian transit systems. And capacity building sites. Both the Federal Transit Administration, the Joint Program Office for ITS, and the U.S. Department of Transportation has oodles of information in their capacity building sites. Sadly, this is something that countries like Canada does not invest in. Most of those efforts for dissemination for pilot projects disappeared in the 1990s when there was a major recalibration of the public sector, and they've not come back. But I think those are very important in terms of spreading the word. Next slide. So how I see this, where we're at. So as I mentioned, initial technical challenges are numerous. Anybody who's been trying to clean up data, simple things like where is the end of the line and how do you deal with negative balances and how do you just find the end of the line on a loop? And, things like that are major headaches, but many transit agencies have resolved that sort of cleaning up of data and quality assurance. Then what happens is there's an application, specific application where this ITS data turns out to be really useful. So then there's a discussion between the planning people, the IT folks, the finance folks, the operation folks, the maintenance folks, sort of saying, okay, how do we share this data? Who's got control of it? How do we deal with cybersecurity? And they come up with an ad hoc solution for that application. But what happens is that over time, once one has been successful, then you do another, then you do another, then you do another. Each one of those builds up buy-in from leadership. But then at some point you realize, well, rather than finding ad hoc arrangements internally to deal with the organizational issues, we really need a strategic approach, a strategic plan based on business intelligence and data governance. And that then leads to a more strategic approach to the use of data at an enterprise deployment level. In parallel, there's been a growing interest in research innovation. There are more and more, one sees the title Chief Innovation Officer or Chief Technology Officer. The other thing that's, I think, has been really positive from my point of view is to sort of see job descriptions. They're not just service planners, but they're business analysts in planning, in operations, in maintenance. And then you start seeing as well data scientists, data engineers. It's not widespread yet, but it's a very positive factor that transit industry is moving in a direction where they understand the value of data and analytics and are trying to acquire the tools and the expertise to do so. And in fact, as one of the efforts Tal pursued, Amber and Willem, they developed a master's level course on mobility data and try to convey some of the tools and some of the knowledge that would make those students more valuable to the industry when they graduate. Next slide. So back to the whole area of academic public transportation industry collaboration. Academics want data, but like I said, there's no such thing as free data. So you need a partnership. And there's different things that academics can do to help. They can develop data quality assurance methodologies. They can provide guidance on the uses of the data. They can provide training. They can conduct new analyses, and we saw a couple examples this morning. Refocusing educational programs, as I just mentioned, data science courses, placing value on applied research, practicum courses that help form business analysts, and projects that lead to placement of students in transit organizations. So you bring in more bright source of expertise for transit agencies. But one of the challenging areas is the fact that procurement remains a challenge because many municipalities, their procurement offices don't see any difference between academics and consultants. And they're different. It's not the same thing. And to try to apply the same rules has been a stumbling block in many, many places. Next slide. So 2 weeks ago, we actually, I was part of the organization committee for a symposium called Research to Practice. All the recordings are available. Send me an email. I'll send them to you. It was called Research to Practice Transit Symposium. But I led a discussion panel on collaboration, and it had two academics from UC Davis and University of Florida, and two leading transit agencies, WMATA in Washington, D.C., and Metro Transit in Minneapolis. And we had a great discussion about different kinds of applications, different kinds of collaboration, and some of the challenges. And in particular, really shout out to WMATA and Metro Transit. Metro Transit has developed its own specific procurement approach for dealing with academics that does the distinction between academics and consultants, and recognizes the special nature of issues that have to be dealt with, such as intellectual property and sole sourcing and access to data and so forth. And WMATA went much further. They actually did a procurement 2-3 years ago where it was a procurement of an academic institution to basically set up a task order approach to applied research. And they're working with MIT, which is, like I said, one of the founders and leaders with Nigel Wilson of this whole environment of dealing with and using transit data. And if you're interested, I can send you can't copy that down, but that's the recording of that day. There was a 3-day symposium, and there was a 45-minute discussion that we had that was fantastic. Next slide. So just to wrap up, a couple examples of applied research. I won't go into this detail because this is the whole purpose of the TAL Research Day, but the TAL team has looked at a whole bunch of different projects, initiatives, applications, different modes, different levels over the years. Next slide. And a couple practical examples of things that I thought that are pretty cool. One was development of a bus bridging decision support tool. Another one was looking at timetable development with transfer optimization, and also when there were multiple depots for scheduling. Next slide. And there's a whole series of resources on this area. Amber mentioned, I've mentioned the Transit Data 2020 Symposium was a 3 days chock-a-block conference with all sorts of, it's a great way of scanning, even though it's 4 years ago, it's a great way of scanning what people are thinking about, what they're using. There have been other TCRP reports, the 235 recently, there's another one on tides. And then, as I mentioned, TRB, it's Committee on Transit Data, and there's also a discussion paper by U.S. Department of Transportation. Next slide. So to finish up, I think we're finally getting to a point that the data-driven future is exciting. It's been a long time coming, but it's happening. And so I'm trying to feel more optimistic as a future, because I think this will have a major benefit and impact for the transit industry. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brendon. Always thought-provoking. It actually triggered a lot of questions. So we have 15 minutes. So I'll actually, so if you can just bear in mind that there's a whole bunch of questions. So
yes, I see. I'll try to be brief.
Yeah. I have actually a few questions of mine as well, but I'll leave those to the end.
Okay.
So yeah, the first one, which also I was thinking about, this categorization, this breakdown of transit agencies, do you see any difference between other places and North America? Like other places a little bit, maybe they have higher percentages in the innovators than us, or like, what's your thought on this?
I think I think Canada perhaps is has more agencies towards the top of the spectrum, at least in the best practice area compared to the US. But as in all things, Canada is somewhere in between the US and Europe. And I think Europe has leaving out of um, leaving out the UK, because that's because of what Thatcher did. That's a totally different situation where Transport for London is cutting edge on many, many things, but the other agencies are in many cases in UK are much worse than off, or the same as Canadian or US agencies in many respects. But Europe, because they're, the cities are much older, they didn't make the pivot to automobile-oriented societies as much as North America. They have strong associations like the VDV in Germany and the UTP in France, and UITP in general was based in Belgium. I think they have more agencies that aren't best practice. That doesn't mean they're perfect, far from it. It doesn't mean they have that many more innovators either. But they also have the European Union, the DRIVE program, which has been, a lot of very interesting projects. So I think, yes, Europe is probably, one can generally say that they're uh, uh, more agencies following best practices. Let's put it that way.
Good, good. Okay, so Michael asks again, if Qtrick really would be in a good position to effectively bridge the gap between research and application. So, what's your thoughts on this?
Let's see. I'm trying to be diplomatic here. Um, I think Qtrick has served a very useful role focusing on um, decarbonization, electric bus technology in particular. They've been very successful in getting, resources to provide assistance to transit agencies and to sponsor pilots. I think the link between Qtrick and CUDA could be better. My understanding was at the beginning, CUDA actually was the uh, seed for Qtrick, but Qtrick sort of went off in a direction where it's basically an association. I understand, they do that to have the resources to do the research they do. Uh, but as a result, the benefits go to members of the association.
Yeah.
And this is where I think government agencies should be playing a role, a much stronger role, like they used to in the 80s and early 90s, of dissemination and supporting, spreading the information as far and wide as possible. So yes, there are things that could happen, but I think there's room for improvement.
Yeah, maybe I can add just one more thing that Qtrick has actually set up an academic committee and they've invited a number of academics with the aim really to bridge the gap between academia and the industry. So it's still early stages, but at least there's an intent to move in this direction. We've been fortunate in the past to work collaboratively with Qtrick on a couple of transit projects, as well as with QTA as well. Of course, there's room for more improvement, but at least I think those efforts um, existed in the past and hopefully will continue in the future. Okay, Jack is asking, how could expanding open data and publicly accessible data help stimulate applied transit research and application of data analytics, especially how lots of applied academic research concentrates on their local area and the data that is publicly available?
Um, there have the publishing of open data in places like that have adopted it widely, like Boston and New York, have resulted in great benefits. It sort of brought out it stimulated interest for people who are really passionate about transit, and so but you have to have a conduit to bring that into what the transit agency actually does. And so some agencies, including New York City first and then TransLink, have actually had set up processes of basically annual procurement of interesting ideas from innovators, from individuals, from companies, and that allows, the LA has done this as well. So it's basically designed to try to tap into that, the stimulation that can come from open data. Uh, but open data is challenging. It takes a lot. Cleaning the data, as all academics know, is huge effort. And most agencies don't have the resources to do it properly, and so they don't really want to publish open data because they don't have the resources to do so. And a lot of politicians sort of, say, oh, open the data, and not realizing how expensive and how complicated that really is, and not providing the resources to make it really feasible. So I'm a strong believer in open data and open source, but it's part of the whole ecosystem that sort of says that policy boards and management need to recognize the need and provide the resources and expertise to do so. Okay.
Good. Yeah. Well, Jeremy's asking if there are any low-hanging fruits or steps that transit organizations without existing expertise in data analytics and data privacy can take towards becoming a best practices organization. So what can such organizations do to really move to the next level?
Well, I guess like I said, you need to you need use cases. You need to get something that is a problem for you, and then tackle it using the data, and then that forces the process of cleaning up the data. So whether it's on-time performance, so whether it's as simple as monitoring departures from terminals, lots of literature suggests the bus doesn't leave the terminal on time, it's never going to be on time. So some agencies have just focused on that. Others have focused on where do you need physical or signal priority, looking at delay at stops, or delay at intersections. Um, what I would suggest is take a scan of the Transit Data 2020 Symposium. You'll see the range of things that people have done, and some are very simple and some are very complicated. And then you sort of, start from there. And then if you're interested, send me an email. I'll send you my little paper about the challenges, because it does provide a pretty comprehensive inventory of what agencies have had to resolve to be able to get to that point to even, be able to use the data.
Good. We have one question on if you found significant differences in data quality amongst the various ITS CAD AVL providers.
Yes. Okay, next question. Uh, I it's it's kind of frustrating because I was part of the team, Peter Firth's team for TCRP 113, and my task was to organize a workshop back in 2005. That's where we tried to get vendors to say to get them to recognize that transit agencies could use the data, but you have to provide it to them. And it still took 13 years, 10, 13 years to get the data in a format. And it's usually in an aggregate form. The data definitions are not clear. There are all sorts of challenges about who owns the data. Hopefully, all transit agencies now, when they procure an ITS system, they get their lawyers to write in there, the data belongs to the transit agency. It is incredible that so many agencies don't do this. So then they go and want to use the data because they get finally the resources to do so. And they don't own the data, so they're going to have to pay licensing fees to use it, and plus the development costs for APIs and so forth. So um, it's anyway that it. But for more sophisticated agencies that do have expertise, the other thing to do is to absolutely require access to the logs, the detailed logs, the breadcrumb data, because a lot of vendors don't provide that openly. They only provide the aggregate reports, and you've got to buy the reports. So there are differences, but those are the kinds of questions one should be asking when you. But the only time to really do is when you procure the system, because once it's in place, that's sort of it. You're going to pay for anything else and develop it. That's the transit agencies didn't realize this until the apps on the cell phones for real time next arrivals happened, and they realized most of them that they did not own the data, and that was a big shock for lots of people.
Okay, Martin has a question about free transit and how would this impact the ability of transit agencies to innovate, in your opinion?
I personally don't think it would help agencies innovate. I think it's a contrary. I'm very concerned. Yes, fares, people are sensitive to fares, and perhaps fares are too high, but I'm very sensitive, very concerned about free fare discussions, because if all that does is um, you put in free fares, and then you realize that the public, the politicians sort of say, hey, wait a second, this is costing too much. What are they going to do? They're going to cut service. There's no way of guaranteeing that the services aren't cut over time. And so that's a challenge. It's a challenge. And I don't really see why free fares improve uh, would improve innovation. I think there's lots of innovations that can take place that deal with what free fares are trying to deal with. For example, a number of agencies have really incorporated accessibility to opportunities as part of their transit service planning processes, and that deals with trying to focus the need of the transit agencies to serve those that don't have access to cars and that are unemployed or poor. You can have social fares for sure, uh, but it's a very complicated discussion, and you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
Paris went from 8 zones to 5 zones, and then eventually to one zone where the entire region was priced the same as the downtown zone, cost 500 million euros a year.
Mhm.
Well, if they'd put that into service, I suspect they would have had a much bigger impact, because the service, as we know, service elasticities, people are much more sensitive to service and
So,
reliability than they are to fares.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Brendon, this is fantastic. You actually raised a lot of points that resonated with me. I'm just going to mention them very, very quickly, and I have one or
Okay,
two comments on each one of them.
sure.
Innovation. I think we need to remind people that we used to innovate in public transit. TTC really has been a pioneer when it came to AVL, when it came to TSP.
TSP.
Right. Even planning, sir, like integrated land use and transit planning. So we used to innovate. You mentioned also the use of data, back in the 80s and 90s and so on. We need to remind ourselves we used to really innovate, and we need to get back to this kind of culture. Number two, I mean, I can't really agree with you more on this concept of dual track research. I learned this the hard way. It took me like, I don't know, 20, 30 years when I would go to transit agencies, propose something, they wouldn't be interested in it, or the other way around. So I figured out in the end, this quid pro quo is really very important. We need to really cater to their needs, and at the same time maybe package something that is a little bit more fundamental research and so on, and they would be okay with this. Yeah, the other point about transit industry treating academics as consultants has always been a big barrier. Transit agencies don't really know how to deal with transit with academics, and But slowly, I think this culture is changing, and it also depends on champions within the transit agency itself. So I just wanted to mention those few points because I feel passionate about them. Uh,
Oh, both of us,
oh,
both of us.
yeah, 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 yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. Again, I hope everyone can.
I'll put my email in the
Yes,
chat, and if anybody wants that discussion paper or that slide with all the hyperlinks, I'll be glad to send it to anybody.
fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session, and then the next one, actually, Brendon is going to moderate, so we'll still enjoy some of his insights and